All right, so we're here at Side Gates. White Labs has joined us for a fun brew downstairs. We got a pale ale going on right now, but I thought it'd be a great time to talk to Chris White about the journey we have been on for the last 20, how many years?
27 years.
Damn, you've been making yeast a long time.
Yeah.
Well, it's been pretty fun to watch you guys grow over the years, and now you have this new product, and pretty excited about it. But let's go back to the beginning. I remember the first video of you that I remember was proving to the MoreBeer guys that the new packaging works well.
Oh yeah, gosh. We have had a long journey together, and both being in California, I was in San Diego at the time, homebrewing. That's why I started White Labs there, and I grew up in San Jose, near where your store is here. So, we had a kind of a good connection from the beginning, and it was all about trying to make the best yeast, right?
Yeah.
For my homebrewing, I was trying to make the best beer possible, which led me to collecting my own yeast strains and growing them in a way that made the beer taste the best, because there's no one way to make yeast. So we still do that same 3-week small batch process to produce all of our cultures. But getting them in a package is a really interesting challenge for this niche company like ours, White Labs, and people making yeast, because we have to get it somewhere. And so when I started selling to homebrewers, it was in these kind of laboratory little tubes that we called vials, and kind of flexible film like this for pro sizes. It's funny, we've come back to that years later after getting to really rigid bottles with a lot of plastic in those bottles. But one of the reasons we had to move out of those original orange capped and blue capped tubes was because of MoreBeer. Because you guys were shipping the yeast all around the country, and that puts a lot of extreme challenges, and they would leak. And I remember you or Olin saying, "Hey Chris, we're gonna have to drop you if you don't fix this." And it's always a challenge with yeast, and no matter what container it's in. A lot of brewers are probably going, yeah. We've seen that, because yeast creates pressure. It's still alive.
It was
and
the
there's
split cap.
billions of cells per mil, right? And even if the tube itself is solid, whatever, the cap isn't, right? So there's different points of weaknesses, and we still work on those things through today. Anyway, I was going to a beer festival in Mammoth and stopped at a store, and there were some candy gummy worms in this really hard tube. And I thought, what is that? Now a lot of people have seen those things from our yeast, and lots of stuff now, right? They're preforms for, at the time, Pepsi bottles was what we found. But they were so indestructible. We had to prove it to you by running it over on my van.
That was the first White Labs video that I can remember. Chris Mueller, right? Yeah. And they throw the yeast way up in the air, let it drop, then drive over it, drive back, hold it upside down, and we're like, we're good to go.
When we just returned to the caps recently, say a year ago with the pro sizes, and we'll talk about the homebrew size, I was still having problems with those with the new phase of caps, because it's always an issue. So we started, remembered of the 90s doing that, so we started just throwing them at the walls, finding the weak points, and kind of going back and remanufacturing the caps a little bit and the threads and stuff, so now no leaking at all.
That's awesome. And one of the things that I think for us as MoreBeer that separated White Labs out, I mean, there wasn't a ton of yeast companies, liquid yeast companies at the time, but there was a few. And we got to go down and visit, and the amount of QA you guys do is insane. It feels like it's lightning years above everyone else at the time, and probably still is. How many quality checks do you guys do?
Especially when you're talking about small batches, and now multiple small batches in San Diego daily, and Asheville and Copenhagen, it takes a whole team of lab people to test at every stage, because it takes 3 weeks to grow it. We don't want to be at the end of the 3-week cycle and something fails. So we test along the way. That's a lot of plating, Petri dishes. That's a lot of PCR now with qPCR. But it's not just equipment, it's people. People that have usually had a degree in biology or biochemistry, something like that, some lab experience. And in San Diego, we're fortunate to have a pretty big biotech community, and so we've always had a good ability to hire, but also then the exposure to they leave for the higher paid jobs in the biotech industry. But in Asheville, too, it's a smaller town, but it's also a college town, and so is Copenhagen, of course. So we really benefit from being in those cities, which are also cool beer cities and breweries, but also great people.
Well, I don't know if people know this, but you guys have locations in all these cities you just mentioned there. So that's pretty rad, and most people don't know that, especially on the homebrew side.
Yeah, and we eventually knew that as we were growing, that San Diego, I mean, you could always get bigger and bigger in one spot, but it makes more sense to get the Yeast closer to some other things like the East Coast.
We both did the same thing.
Right?
Yeah.
You did the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's not just to save shipping costs. I mean, it's a lot more expensive to run another laboratory and building than just paying extra in shipping. But it's also about the community and doing better at what we do and being closer to our customers.
Then you went to these hard plastic, we call them vials still, but they were the blanks. And my dad worked for Pepsi, so when you sent that first one, I was like, oh, you got a punt or a blank. But those were hugely popular in homebrewing. In fact, people tended to store other things in them afterwards. I mean, screws, of course, nothing weird or illegal. So why don't you go through kind of that transformation?
So since we always think about how to get yeast to the breweries and the homebrew stores and things like that, really all over the world now, in the best physiology, the highest viability, that's kind of led us to making yeast better in our facilities, but also how they have the highest viability. When I took the early brewing classes at UC Davis in the early 90s, you'd say, well, yeast only had a few days shelf life. And I remember Michael Lewis one time, the longtime professor there saying, oh, yeast would always be different if you get it from a facility. That's why breweries all made it their own themselves at that time. So I always thought that was a great challenge. Keep the yeast the same all the time. And I think we do with our cryogenic freezing and people that just work on our freezes and our cultures. And that's why I've always been really heavily invested in QA. It keeps our yeast the same, it creates a great process, and then try to find a pathway to the highest viability possible. So I knew people might be missing the caps on those vials, but maybe not the pressure that would be created inside, because those could hold like 100 PSI, right? So I wanted to find a way to vent that CO2 out. You can't just do it like coffee or something because it's liquid. So you can't just put a filter in there or something. And then I saw that, in biotechnology, which I'm still close to in some different avenues, they were growing a lot of microbes in film. But they weren't thinking about it from transporting or concentrated. So we created PurePitch, which was a way to grow the yeast in the film instead of stainless steel. But the biotech industry had kind of moved to that because you could guarantee they were sterile better than CIP. A big stainless tank. So that also was beneficial to us. Then heat sealing the yeast in the film, so in concentrated format. So nice thing about film is you can see what's going on rather than stainless, but also you can see the culture. Now we can do it for every different strain has a different harvest. So we call that part of the process the harvest, and there's a harvest every day as there's a new yeast being pitched and different things. So every strain is harvested differently because they grow differently, just like different crops grow differently, different humans have different weights. And so we've really nailed that down, and so we can collect the yeast and then we can have them in this film to the brewery so it releases CO2 and keeps the viability super high, way higher than anything else out there, because we've been focusing on that. Because not only does the film release CO2, there's no packaging step, no filler or something where you're introducing oxygen. Like in beer, when you package a beer, that's for the oxygen exposure, beer gets oxidized. With yeast, if you get oxygen into the mixture, which you'd have through any filler, it's a little different thing. The yeast think, oh, I got oxygen, I want to do something with it.
It's time to activate.
So their viability is going to go down much faster. So by eliminating the oxygen pickup, we don't have that viability drop, and then we have the gas release.
Well, it also feels like by eliminating doing that, you no longer have that pain point, that risk point of, not just oxygen, but if someone didn't sanitize that equipment well, if anything was to go wrong, that's an easy time to pick up. And so if you're growing it in here and it's already packaged, you just have to seal it. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, you're reducing the potential for contamination, and you're improving the viability of the yeast. So we got a couple patents around that. And then the funny thing is, I still get comments today sometimes when somebody says something, maybe I communicated it poorly in the past, but that, oh, well, of course this was cheaper to do. And I've never run our business that way. And I guess I could be a better business person if I ran it that way, but I've always been about ROI will figure itself out. If you make the best thing possible, things will get figured out. And I've led me to a bunch of mistakes, but also some successes. And this is way more expensive than it ever used to be to make our yeast.
I was part of that. I got to be part of the behind the scenes of that project, and I assure you, this is by no means saving money by doing this. The first iterations you did that were in Davis and such, I mean, that you spent a ton of money perfecting this process before you even released it.
Right, we built the whole lab here in Davis at a time we didn't have a lot of room in San Diego to create this process. And there was failure after failure after failure after failure for several years. People even in the industry that work with film and heat sealing said, you can't do it, it's impossible. And we sort of like to make the impossible possible. It's fun challenges, so we eventually succeeded. And it still wasn't perfect, and now it's kind of perfect from a standpoint of it's indestructible.
Let's talk about the new packaging and the new size, because that's kind of exciting too. It's something we pushed you guys for a long time, was getting more cells, like more and more cells, so that the home brewer didn't have to think, didn't have to plan, didn't have to do a ton of work before they brewed.
Yes, and White Lab started with the idea of pitchable, which didn't exist in liquid yeast at the time. There were some other producers who were good, but you had to grow it up. A brewery would have to buy a liter and grow it up in a barrel. A home brewer, the reason the word starter started is because there was nothing to pitch 5 gallons with. And it's funny, it's still talked about, which is cool. It's become this whole aspect of home brewing, which is really interesting. But at the time, you had to grow the yeast up. So our yeast strain numbers, WLP, stands for White Labs Pitchable, because that was a differentiator, or disruptor, whatever, I don't know, call it at the time, because it wasn't available. But pitchable has always continued to sort of change in what definition that is, and sometimes that's spurred by competition. So we entered the homebrew yeast market and pro yeast market in 1995 with a much bigger quantity. And now other companies have done that. So, okay, push us. I like that. And that's really the consumer, the home brewer doing that. We kind of went through a lot of different things, but eventually we really needed to listen to what people were asking. The number one thing, please make a larger size. So we decided to try to fuse the other aspect of the number one request, having a cap. Can you please get a cap again, was a big question we got. And I didn't even realize how much of a convenience thing the United States really relies on. So we fused the PurePitch kind of with the old technology, but it's still grown in the film at PurePitch, to have now a larger size with a cap. And there's a lot of technology in this. The film is better. It's not 2-layer. It's still 2-layer, but it's fused together. The other one you kind of cut out you could cut it out and pull out the inside part, and then But now you don't have to do that. It's all fused together. There's a lot more room on the label for things. We've got a QR code on the back that brings you to the QC sheet and information, and a calculator that was all part of this project. Like, our calculator is unlike really any other calculator around. The other ones are great. Ours is more specific for white labs, but it tells you millions of cells per mil per degree Plato, or just millions of cells per mil, and there's a little dial that you can move. Finding it might be the hard part, just like finding the QR code might be the hard part. But you can find out exactly how much volume of this yeast, because it's all at 2.15 billion cells per mil, to achieve a certain pitch rate. And we tell you on the front that it's 7.5 million cells per mil if you use one of these into 5 gallons, 20 liters. But you might want 10 million cells per mil, you might want 15. With the cap, you can use exactly how much you want, or you can even use a little bit and make a starter and cap it back up. And we've done a lot of work wondering whether that would reduce the viability, because we're so concerned about viability. And we have found that by opening the cap, using a little bit or how much you want, put the cap back on, it still has the same viability up to the shelf life, which is a very long shelf life, 7 months on this yeast. That's kind of what we resulted in. So a larger size with a cap, so really modular. We improved, PurePitch was a huge leap in viability percentage for homebrew yeast. You guys are the ones telling me we don't even talk about that enough, because we're so geeky internally trying to get the highest viability, and that's why you asked me about it today. But we got even another improvement in viability with this new film.
If you watch some of our previous videos, the last couple batches, I've gone back to liquid yeast, surprisingly, and been using white labs again.
It's all the same strains, right? We worked, one thing, as I said, we were able to really refine every harvest by strain as part of this, we call PPNG, PurePitch Next Generation process. We had daily meetings for several years. And one of the things we did on the Pro size is create a connector that they can aseptically transfer in line into their beer going into the fermenter. We call that the FlexPump. Based on a peristaltic pump, which is very common outside the brewing industry. Anything going into a fermenter would use a peristaltic pump. But since brewers traditionally don't add things into the fermenters for being scared of contamination and oxygen pickup, valid concerns, our industry just hasn't done that as much. But now there's more and more people that want to add biofine in a fermenter, add fruit, add zinc. You know, there's more interest in adding things to a fermenter now, so this flex pump can be used for those different things. But I'm pretty sure there's a great DIY solution for homebrewers to connect here and go into you wouldn't even really need the peristaltic. You could. I'm sure you have a lot of your customers doing big batches.
We were talking about making a TC fitting to that thread, so we could pitch in our conical by just closed, squeeze it right in there.
And you can squeeze it right in. This is really easy to get out. And we left a lot of headspace here for that reason. We really wanted you to be able to shake it up and get it in. Now, of course, in this, it's a little easier than the Pro sizes to get everything out, but it's still nice to flush it.
So like toothpaste, do you have any tips for people on, do you roll it, do you squeeze it, do you fold it and roll it?
Well, I think the biggest one is the WLP002 challenge, English ale yeast. And it's the one we really work the most with because it's the most flocculent yeast. Mm-hmm. You know, it gets described as being curdled before, which is not really true. It's just the way it looks, so chunky. It's not dairy, but you know, it's chunky. So, you know, we have to make sure that yeast strain, that this cap works for that yeast strain, that the transfer works for that yeast strain. So that one just feels like solid in here, right? Where California ale yeast is a little more jiggly. And it's a lot better to get out. Like, it's a super flocculent yeast too, only when it's cold. Where English ale yeast will be chunky all the time. And this one reason why California ale yeast is a little bit better at attenuation. It stays in solution. But if you chill it, it falls to the bottom very, very well. It's also why it's a great bottle conditioning yeast. So if California ale yeast is not cold, it's a lot easier to get out.
So let's go through that. So somebody gets this in the mail or picks it up in a local store, and they're going to brew in 2 weeks, so they put it in their fridge. When would you recommend, if they're just going to pitch right into their fermenter, when do you recommend them taking it out of the fridge?
You know, when Jamil Zanishev co-wrote the yeast book with me about 10 years ago, Jamil was really, really big on just go with best practice. If you tell the person, well, here's the best practice, that's what we should write. And that also changes over time because people find another better way to do it. But traditional stuff that was handed down by brewers over the years tends to be right. They didn't know why it was right? But they found better results, and that's why you learn from brewers. That's why you went to school. They were doing microbiology before knowing there was microbiology. There was microbes, right? So one of the things that brewers would do is kind of get the temperature of the yeast close to the temperature of the wort. In lager brewing, that was cold. So I think you want to get the yeast close to the temperature you're pitching. If you're pitching at 68, give it a few hours. You can give it overnight. It's going to be okay, but you don't need it, right? I mean, this is already getting close to 68 here. So a few hours. When you start brewing, take the yeast out. Whether it's all grain or extract doesn't really matter. And it's going to attemperate, which also brings the yeast into a different metabolic state. Is it essential? No. If you pitch this cold, it's going to work. The yeast is going to mix in the wort. It's going to start fermenting. But again, going to tradition, and brewers brewing thousands of batches of beer, they would tell you, attemperate it. And again, that wasn't much when it was cold lagering. And a lot of professional breweries have yeast brinks that are kept cold, and they pitch in line. So you can see they don't go through something to get it to that temperature. So there are lots of examples where people don't do that either. But I think in home brewing, it's pretty darn easy to follow a best practice that, if you call that something that's been handed down, and pull it out with your other ingredients.
I was going to say, that's perfect time. Pulling your hops out, pull this out, let it sit. So then now they got it, and they're going to pitch. This seems so much easier than the prior packaging in terms of what you're going to do. So are you just doing a little spray bottle, or what are you doing?
Yeah, we're just spraying it, and then if you have a flame and that kind of stuff, pour it. But that's how I used to do home brewing with a little flame. But excuse me, that's not what the industry does. So traditionally, people again, especially before the advent of some of the thoughts of microbiology, there was a lot of open contact. But since I came from microbiology side, I approached homebrewing a little differently. Like, I always transferred. I didn't pour hot wort or cold wort anywhere. I always transferred it aseptically, which is why I'm excited to get to something that can be transferred aseptically. Because when you transfer anything through air, it's going to pick up the microbes in the air. So the more the room's clean, the drafts are prevented, the fans are turned off. A flame is helpful because it just pushes that stuff out, and it gives you a nice window of less microbes. It's not sterile, but it's pretty good. Like, you can usually have a flame right here and a petri dish right here, and if you're getting your room's pretty clean, your cell count, your CFUs that'll grow on this plate might be 1 or 2 versus 100 over here.
Yeah, no, I just think that the more you can just kind of pre-work it, know it's going to come out well, spray the top, crack it open in a homebrew setting. I know we're not aseptic in this, but pour it in. We'll find a way someday.
Yeah, and if you have some sterile water or something, you can pour a little in there.
Good call.
Bottled water. You can pour a little of that in, put the cap back on, shake it, add that back in too.
Cool. Well, we learned a ton about the new packaging, so let's go pitch this yeast.